Welcome to Reliability Matters, a podcast for the electronic assembly industry. Each episode covers topics related to reliability, best practices, and environmentally responsible assembly techniques, with insights from experts across the electronic assembly industry. Now, here's your host, Mike Conrad.
Welcome back to another episode of the Reliability Matters podcast. I'm so glad you're with me today. Most of us are well aware of the supply chain shortages, both from within our industry and well beyond. Some of us are also keenly aware of labor shortages. This show is all about reliability of circuit assemblies. While reliability is often referred to as a process, it is also rooted in culture. Reliability begins with people. So instead of talking about common reliability subjects on this particular episode, such as voiding, soldering materials, assembly best practices, and the plethora of other usual suspect topics, I thought it would be a good idea to talk about people. After all, as I said, reliability begins with people. My guest today is Dr. John Mitchell. Many of you know John as the president and CEO of IPC, one of our industry's largest trade associations. John has recently written a book entitled Fire Your Hiring Habits. I have to admit, the title was quite intriguing to me. Here's a little background on John. Since 2012, Dr. John Mitchell has served as president and CEO of IPC. And for those of you not in our industry, IPC is a not-for-profit trade association driving competitive advantages for more than 3,000 companies across the globe. Leading the global operations and staff, John manages the creation and execution of the board of directors' goals. Under his leadership, IPC has essentially doubled the total company membership globally, as well as increased the acceptance of standards by over 50%. John led the charge for IPC's online certification portal and the company's overhaul of its member success department. His efforts served to improve relations with members and helped move the needle on positive regulatory change. John did have a life before IPC, and prior to IPC, John was an engineer with General Electric Aerospace and was a founding member of Alpine Electronics Research Company, which pioneered modern navigation systems in the U.S. OEM market. John himself holds a patent in GPS navigation systems. John then served as general manager and director of the largest product development initiative in Bose Corporation's history. He went on to become the CEO of Golden Key International Society, the noted collegiate honor society serving over 2 million members. John earned his doctorate in higher education management from University of Georgia's Institute of Higher Education, a Master of Business Administration from Pepperdine University, and a Bachelor of Science in Electrical and Computer Engineering from Brigham Young University. In addition to his work with IPC, John is an in-demand speaker and author of 2 books so far. Got to ask him what so far means. John has served on numerous boards, and I'm pleased to welcome him to the Reliability Matters podcast. Hi, John.
Thanks, Mike. Good to be here.
It's great to have you. Welcome to the show. This is your, as I recall, this is your second appearance, I believe, on the show.
I believe it is. Yep.
Yeah. So welcome back is a more appropriate
Thank you.
greeting. So this happened.
Yeah.
Tell me before we get into the subject of clearly what the subject is, but before we get into the details of the book, what inspired you? You have a busy job. You're running one of the biggest trade organizations in our industry. You're growing leaps and bounds. I can't imagine there was just a ton of extra time looking to be filled. So what made you do that?
No, there's not a ton of extra time. That's right. But it's an important topic. So, our industry, the electronics industry, has struggled finding the right people to fill roles. And this isn't just something from the pandemic occurs for us. This has been going on for decades. We're always trying to find the right talent, the right person to fill a role. And so, the purpose in working on this is IPC has been working, for decades trying to help the industry solve these issues. So a lot of this information is what we do day to day. We're trying to help organizations solve their workforce challenges. And so as I considered writing this book, it was really a treatise on solving two big problems: how to find people and how to keep people. In fact, one of the early titles that we considered was Finders Keepers,
Good title, yeah.
But so that's where it was. So it really ties into it. And I justified the time because all the proceeds from the book actually go to the IPC Education Foundation. And
I didn't know that.
It's actually helping fund our industry's workforce, which is important. It's a win-win, I think, across it. So it aligns with what we do at IPC, and it's also helping the industry go forward.
Was this book based upon what you've learned in your career? Is it basically a model of how you hire people at IPC?
Yeah, some of it. It's not just IPC though. So, like you mentioned, I worked at Bose, I've worked at Alpine, General Electric. I didn't do a lot of hiring at GE; those were the early days. But in every subsequent company that I'd been in, I've interviewed literally thousands of candidates. I've taken teams and grown them, changed them, started them from scratch. And so I draw on a lot of that experience, but it's also drawing on, the experiences of, many of your listeners. I have the unique opportunity to work with, the leaders of the electronics industry around the globe. And so I share many of those experiences. It's really intended to talk about how many of these issues are global in nature. It doesn't matter whether you're sitting in Asia, North America, or Europe. There's stories and experiences on how some of these situations are similar, but some are also different.
Yeah. I started my company 31 years ago, and when I first started, we couldn't rub two nickels together to make a dime. We were severely underfunded, and I was completely naive, which helped actually, because if I were any smarter, I probably wouldn't have started it. I would have been too scared to start it. No regrets. But the criteria back in 1992 for hiring was, do you have a pulse? Will you shoot me? Will you steal from me? If those were no, will you accept this pay? If that's a yes, you're hired, right?
Come on in. Yeah.
Yeah. And then we would, if we were impressed with someone, we would promote, and we would promote to their level of incompetency. And then they would get frustrated, or we would fire. Right, exactly. And I do a lot of public speaking on the subject of entrepreneurship, but it's not what to do. It's what not to do. Because I found that the way I learn is by learning what doesn't work and avoiding what doesn't work. And eventually you're left with things that do work, right? It's kind of a process of elimination. How much of your experience was based on that kind of, well, we won't do that again, or we'll do it differently?
So I've been fortunate. I hear a lot of those, there's the horror stories.
Yeah.
And, we include a few of those, but we also try to, I'm not interested in dragging anybody, behind the bus, if they had, a bad experience. And so we also encapsulate a lot of those stories in more of a generic way. And, at the end of many of the chapters, we take a fictitious two competing companies, and then we illustrate, the various principles that we're talking about through, and what I found interesting or enjoyable actually is as I was writing that, you actually, as you're reading the bad example, it sounds real familiar to a lot of places we work.
I'm sure you get a lot of nods, head nodding as they're reading, right?
This is. What do you mean that's bad? That's exactly what I'm doing.
Yeah. Your style of writing reminds me of Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, where he studied pairs of publicly traded companies in identical fields. So Schick and Gillette, for example, for skincare.
Yeah.
And he chose publicly traded companies because he had access to their financials, and he figured out what all the companies that did well have in common and all the companies that did poorly have in common. And it seems like your approach was somewhat similar. You took pairs of competing companies, and obviously one probably excelled and one probably struggled, and identified the attributes.
Typically when you find me citing the specific company, I will cite them when they're doing well.
Of course, yes.
Give credit where credit is due,
Exactly.
But if, hey, by the way, I had this experience.
And an unnamed competitor.
By the way, that person's not really going to be, because people change and organizations change, hopefully. We're always changing and hopefully always getting better.
Well, change or die. That's the way it works, right? 75% of all companies, statistically, U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, 75% of all companies fail ultimately. 10 years is the mark for failure. Like 50% fail in 5 years. Horrible odds. But I don't think business is risky. I think the company founders fail to develop the proper skill sets for the level of business they're doing. And the ones that fail, 100% of them probably fall into very similar situations where they just fail to adapt or acquire new skills.
Well, and this is one of the things I didn't try to over-intellectualize this book. We're really trying to make it a practical manual. Mm-hmm. And so when I was talking about it with the outline with teams and people that would help me find some data on it and things like that, really the outline, what I wanted to have happen here was something that, anybody who's interested in hiring or keeping key staff or important, they wanted to be a reference manual. Say, okay, I'm in the phase of finding somebody. What are the things I should be doing? And then highlight that. Now they're here. What do I have to do to make sure that they stay? And so as opposed to just inundating people with just masses of statistics, well, there's data there because I'm an engineer. You have to have data. But I really wanted to make it be very approachable for, a first-time team leader or, your CEO.
Yeah, and I imagine one of the challenges in implementing the knowledge in this book is many times, companies have, the larger companies particularly, are very siloed just by nature. You have your engineering department, you have your, admin teams, you have HR teams, legal teams, et cetera.
And product, even on the product side, I mean, we're seeing so many companies today, even just talking about splitting or, breaking pieces off because they're so siloed.
Yeah. And that silo effect is, if the company founder or if the executive team wants to adopt the principles in your book, does that get down to the HR department? Is how, the HR department really, if you're a large enough company to have a completely separate department that does all your recruiting and hiring, they may not be in the same culture mindset as the people on the floor, right?
Yeah, HR managers that read my book might get a little annoyed at some of my suggestions, which are, the owners of the position really need to get involved.
Exactly.
They have to be involved. You can't delegate this responsibility fully. You can delegate some pieces of it to get you to but when it comes down to the real decision making, when you get it down to that core set, it really comes down to the hiring manager and the hiring team.
Yeah, we don't want to see HR managers work like purchasing managers. The job of a purchasing manager is, tell me what kind of thing you need. I'll go shopping. I'll negotiate the best price. And sometimes what they get is not quite what they asked for. And we help our customers write RFQs, because if they don't write an RFQ specifically enough, then they're going to get what they asked for, but they didn't ask for enough, right? And then it goes to the low bidder, and then no one's happy, and they don't get buy-in. Let's talk about your book.
Okay.
I went through the chapters, and the chapter titles. Usually, I do a lot of research and I figure out what questions I should ask. But the title of your chapters are basically an interviewer's dream, because the way you organized your chapters and the title of the chapters really is a good walkthrough for this dialogue that we're having right now. Chapter 1 is acquisition and retention. The two giant goals, right? Start with the hard stuff, acquisition and retention. We find it used to be, before the latest madness the last few years has brought us, acquisition was not a problem. As the economy goes up and down, I have this theory that when the unemployment rate is when the government posted unemployment rate is 5%, it's basically zero, because there's probably about 5% of I'll speak for the American marketplace. It's probably the same worldwide. There's probably about 5% of people that really don't want to work or can't work or shouldn't work, whatever the case may be. So when it gets down to mid-single digits, it's slim pickings out there. But when the economy is not doing as well, when unemployment is higher, then hiring people is a little bit easier. Retention is hard.
Just if you're going to jump in on that just for a second.
Yeah, please.
I feel like in both of those situations, it's challenging. So you have less to choose from when things are going well and everybody has a job, right? But at the same time, when people are laying people off, or a lot of people lay off, they're not laying off their best people. The best people always seem to have jobs, so trying to find them is still challenging. True.
Yeah. And there is a little bit of a bias when I interview people. In the back of my mind, I'm like, why are you here? If you're all that in a bag of chips, why are you looking for a job? And that's always a tough question to answer.
I hope you're asking that question. I hope because they better have a good answer.
I ask it in a funny way. My business is in California, and we have very strange regulations of what we're allowed to ask and what we're not allowed to ask. But we have a cheat sheet of things that you are not allowed to ask and ways to get the answer. For example, we can't ask someone if they have a car unless they're required to use their car for work. Then what we can ask is, do you have a reliable form of transportation to and from the office? But we can't ask if they have a car. We can no longer ask how much they made in their prior job.
Interesting.
And I find that a really important question, and it always puts a potential employee, it makes them nervous to answer the question because they think it's part of the negotiating thing. It's not. I want to make sure that they're not taking a cut in pay. I want to make sure, because then retention is going to go out the window. Right. It'll be a stepping stone. I want to make sure, I want to know what their value was to the prior organization. And because for me anyway, hiring is never about the money. We don't pay based on a pre-designated pay scale. We pay based on value, And anyway, acquisition and retention. Acquisition is one thing, retention is another. So talk to me about Chapter 1. How do we find and how do we keep? Finders keepers.
So what we do in Chapter 1 is introduce the broad topics, okay, and kind of set you up for understanding where the book is going to take you. Acquisition and retention are the two main themes of the entire book. And so this is kind of the introduction to them, what we mean by that. In acquisition, we share that we're going to include two different things. So there's the actual finding of people, but there's also the onboarding before they're really employed. If you screw up the onboarding, you really didn't hire them. So we put the finding of people and the hiring of people under the acquisition section. And then under retention, there is so much. And retention actually bleeds over into acquisition is one of the things that we start to introduce there. And we talk more about it later in the book. But retention is about the way you work with employees, the way you treat employees, your culture. We talk a little bit about, one of the chapters that we're going to, I'm sure you'll, as you go down the list, diversity and inclusion is, how does that help or hinder a workplace? And so all of those factors are about how you keep people engaged. And like you said, it's not just about money. It really never has been. Money's a factor. It's just not the only factor. And too many people think that way. Mm-hmm. And all of those things like the culture and the way you treat people and that stuff leaks out and it goes back and it affects your acquisition as well. Because if the word gets out that, this is not the kind of place that I'm looking for because of the culture, you're not going to be able to bring the people you want to bring in either.
Yeah. And I know you have a PhD in higher education, and as smart as you are. Oh, okay, yes. And yes, that's true. And as educated as you are, and as talented as you are, as successful as you've been, I don't think culture is very difficult to teach. Skills are easy to teach compared to culture. Culture you find, you discover, you can't really teach culture. Is that correct?
I can cover it now. We can cover it in the culture chapter if you're going to use that as the outline. But you can't. I don't feel like you can teach culture, but you can build culture.
Yeah.
Okay. And it comes down to people. A culture is not just funky signs that you hang up and say, hey, look, we're a hip group.
Teamwork makes the dream work. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's nice, but really not very relevant. More often, it's just going to get mocked than paid attention to. So it's really about making sure that the people that you have as part of your organization are the way you want your organization to exhibit culture. I share an example in the book of it's called, you can Google it, it's called Happy Marriott from the Marriott Hotels. And, I shared an experience where a colleague of mine was interviewing people, and he happened to be interviewing one of the executives at Marriott. And so he's staying at a Marriott. And from the minute he walks in the door, people are greeting him. They're happy, they're friendly, they're helpful. Every single person from, the cleaning staff to the front desk to the people in the restaurant. And so as he moves into the interview the next day, he says, how do you train people to be so happy? And the guy kind of looks at him strangely. He's like, we don't. He's like, well, what do you do? And he's like, we just hire happy people.
Yeah.
And so you're not going to convince a curmudgeon that suddenly they need to be super energetic and outgoing and, smiling all the time. That's just not who they are.
Right.
So you have to hire for the attributes that you're looking for.
I heard a similar speaker talk about the differences between, a Hilton Hotel and a Four Seasons, and how when he went to a Four Seasons, everyone greeted him, and it didn't seem contrived. It all seemed organic. My wife used to work for a bank back before she retired, and they would go on a recruiting drive to hire tellers and other bank employees, and they would go to Nordstrom. There was a mall down the road. They would go to Nordstrom, and they would try and poach employees for Nordstrom. Every once in a while, they'd buy tickets to Disneyland before they were $10,000 a day, and because Disney hired people who fit their culture,
the attributes that they're looking for.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a good point, and I do agree with you completely that culture, although it can't be trained, it can certainly be appreciated because people don't know what they don't know, and as soon as they're in a culture that they're not familiar with, that they love, then they embrace it and they build upon it, right?
Totally. I mean, so I worked at Bose, as you mentioned before, for about 6 years, and I've never been in a company where more people came back to the company. So it was around just after the .com bubble, and so many people went off to try, so you've got a bunch of MIT engineers throughout the organization, and several of them like, hey, I'm going to go off and make my place in the world. And occasionally that didn't work, or maybe often, but I can't tell you how many people that I ran into that were like, oh yeah, I'm back. And Bose was fantastic in taking them back. They were like, they didn't start them over as employees. Yeah, there was a gap of maybe 18 months or something, or 2 years, whatever they were gone for. But if they'd been there 5 years before, they started at year 6.
Yeah, we've had the same experience. In Australia, there's a phenomenon called the walkabout. Particularly men will just say, "I'm going to go walk through the outback." Going on a walkabout. That could be a year or two, right? It's just finding themselves or whatever. And sometimes employees, want to know what it's like out there, and we respect that. My job is to not get in their way, and I think if you try really hard to retain somebody, particularly with, "Please don't leave, I'll throw more money at you," you're just buying another few months. They need to, like a bird in the hand, let it go. It'll come back if it's meant to. And
if it's meant to, yeah.
And when they come back,
if you have an employee that comes to you and says, hey, I've got another offer, are you willing to compete with me? They've already got one foot out the door.
Yeah, I always say no to that.
It's like, enjoy, have a good time.
Yeah. And really, it's not our job to stand in their way. They have a destiny. And if we try and mess with their destiny, not to get too philosophical here, but if they're meant to go, if we were a stepping stone and we provided value to them and that it got them to the next job, good for us. And
we need to know that that's okay.
Exactly.
You hire somebody, and as long as you're getting the value, I mean, you hope you get at least a couple years out of them.
Right.
But because if they're switching every 6 months, you're just getting them trained, and then you've wasted your time. But if you get a couple years, or everything beyond that is a bonus, especially in today's world, because there's just so many options out there. But as long as your organization is structured so that you can quickly convey that information, there's a big chunk of the book that we talk about rapidly training, and that's part of onboarding. It's part of how you keep people in terms of the retention piece as well. And so doing that effectively, helping them grow, is a great motivator for people to want to stay, because you're investing in them, but they may not, and we need to be okay with that.
Yeah, I totally agree. Chapter 2, a glance back, a vision forward. So
yeah. So
before let me just throw a couple of comments in. Let's start with looking at a glance back. Historically, how did we go about the practice of hiring people? And then let's switch to forward,
sure,
if that works.
So we started off, what the chapter does is, where we're at today came from somewhere. Right. And so I try to take a look, not too in depth. I didn't want to bore people, workforce academics can spend, books on just that topic alone, but I did not. We spent, a few pages. So as we're going through it, we talk about how the types of workers that we had and what kind of training they would receive has changed over the years. Much of if you look back, I started basically in the 1800s. The vast majority of employees were agricultural in nature. And if you then fast forward to just a decade or two ago, it's single digits, And so we've drastically changed in the types of workers. We drastically have changed in the types of, production and the systems that we have. And so it's really a look at some of the changes that have come across the globe as we've as we've grown and advanced, and how we prepared workers and what we expected of workers. The whole knowledge worker thing, used to be limited even as early as the 40s, 1940s. It was like, oh, that's that 5% group that might, be using their brains, the doctors, the engineers, the scientists, if you will. And now it's like 80% is, where people think knowledge workers will be going. At least that's what, and there's some problems with that too, because we don't all need to be knowledge workers to be effective or happy.
Let's switch to chapter 3 and talk about recruiting. The old days when we started, we ran an ad in a classified, in the local paper, and then as the internet and various companies started exploiting that space, I'm thinking of Indeed and ZipRecruiter and even
Sure.
social media platforms like LinkedIn. They became, they took over from that, and then the search got wider, which was good and bad, right?
Yep.
You cast a really large net, you're going to get some great trophy fish, and you're going to get some piles of plastic. You're going to get all that. So, how does current and what you would consider the future of recruiting contrast with kind of legacy methods?
So, the current, I would just say, are in some cases reimagined methodologies that we used in the past. So in the past, we would send in a resume. Today, you email it in or you put it on LinkedIn. And so there's still a search. It's just now we've modernized those techniques in terms of reading the resumes, looking for those keywords. And as you said, that's good and bad. If you get 10,000 resumes, you're not going to get through them. So some keyword searching can be helpful, but you also have to be careful, because you could be eliminating fantastic candidates that are just going to show up or get out in the filter. So some of the future things that I recommend is, again, this is where we talk about getting the hiring manager more hands-on. If you are utilizing some support in terms of your finding, whether it's an HR group or an outside consultant or what have you, you really need to be specific about what can or cannot work. When I was at Bose, we were setting up a brand new team, and we had a lot of us younger, we can do anything type of attitudes. No problem is too big. We'll just engineer it to death, and we will solve the world. And I was working with a recruiter, and I spoke with her, and I said, hey, I'd also like on part of my senior team, if you've got somebody that has at least 30 years of experience, maybe even has recently retired, I need at least one of those people on the team. And she's like, that's fantastic. Tell me why, because we've got a lot of those people. I was like, because I need somebody that's going to sit there and just shake their head at us and go, you guys are idiots. We've been down that path. Here's all the pitfalls that you don't want to do, because, experience is part of what helps us make better decisions. And you don't always have to go through it yourself.
Almost the Abraham Lincoln team of rivals approach, that where you want that. If you only had all experienced people, nothing new will come out, because that one person will go, been there, done that, next. And if you only had inexperienced people with a little bit more naive, anything is possible, then you're going to fall down those rabbit holes and hit the potholes and all that. But there is a blend. There's a blend of that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And we cover that a little. I cover that more on the second half of the retention in terms of diversity and things like that, because it's not just, when I think about diversity, it's not just gender and ethnicity. That's part of it, but it's experience. It's also age. It's geography. It's, background. It's so many things. And the more diversity you can bring into that team, the more successful you could be.
Yeah.
But back down to the, so in addition to getting the management or the hiring managers more involved, we also share different tools. Like here's, I give them a recruiting worksheet, things to look at, things that they ought to be trying and doing. We point out some of these, there's a fantastic book that it's a little bit older now, but it's still, I think, very applicable, by a couple of Stanford professors, Pfeffer and Sutton, called, I'm going to mess up the title, but it's Hard Facts, Dangerous Half-Truths, and Total Nonsense, or something like that.
Great title.
It was fantastic. And one of the half-truths is is the nepotism piece. So we've all seen it where, some owner of a company hires their witless cousin, right, that can't do anything, and we're all stuck working with that person. But on the other hand, I talk about how during the interview process, as you're talking with people, we give you tools on interviewing as well. But you get a limited set of experience before you hire somebody. Sometimes it's like 3 hours. Maximum, if you're really detailed, you might have a total of 12 hours of experience with your company through the interview process, and then you're investing in this individual. Whereas if you have a great employee that says, hey, I want to hire Mike Conrad because I've known Mike Conrad for a decade and I know who he is and what he does, well, that's a decade of experience that as a reference, and as long as you trust that reference, you just can't get that in an interview situation. So just tools like that.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, nepotism has a bad rap because everyone has a horror story, like you said, the crazy nephew.
Stories are real.
Yeah, they're true, but they're not exclusive. And
that's right.
I think we take the best of nepotism. I am always encouraging our staff to recommend people they know, right? Yep. And is that nepotism? Well, kinda, but not sort of. But there's no obligation. We're not obligated to hire crazy cousin Ed.
We've hired spouses, we've hired children, so that really is nepotism. When it's a strong relation, we just have to, you put up safeguards, right? They don't report to each other, different groups and stuff like that.
Exactly. We've had the same, we're a small company and we've had the same issue. We, all of a sudden relationships develop and it's like, you both can't work in accounting. One of you has to do something else. Let's talk about Chapter 5, Pathways and Upscaling. I mentioned at the early part that we used to promote to the level of incompetency and then fire them or they get frustrated and quit. I think one of the ways to address the retention is for someone to, if they choose to, if they desire this, is to know that they can do more and climb the ladder. And then there are some that are just, we have one person in our company that does his job exceptionally well and has he's probably wiser than most of us, absolutely has no interest in quote unquote climbing the ladder. He's very happy with what he's making, with what he does. That's his world. And God love him. I mean, I'm blessed to have someone like that work with us. But not everyone, I think he's kind of in the minority. Everyone thinks they want to climb the ladder. And so how do we provide pathways for that? And how do we ensure that we protect them from making a decision where they leave a position they love and they go into a position maybe they don't love.
Yeah. So now we're firmly in the retention area, pathways and upskill, right? So this is how you keep your employees. And when an employee comes in, if they have no vision of how they go from where they're at to where they would like to go, that's a problem. If they don't understand what the steps are, then, how many, I can't tell you how many stories I've heard of people where they come into their annual review. And that's a whole different topic about, especially if you're only talking once a year, that's bad. But they come into there and they're like, okay, where do I go from here? What's the upside potential? Where, how do I say I'm a production engineer? How do I become, say I'd like to be a senior quality assurance engineer. What's the path for me to go there? And if you as a company don't have clear steps, that's a detriment, because it's really, they're going to look for places that are going to show them how they can get where they want to go. On the upskilling, it's slightly different. So as you're on the pathway, you're taking step by step by step. Let's say I'm I'm an engineer and I would like to become a fellow within an organization, right? That expert in this specific area. While I'm moving along that path, assuming I've got really well-defined steps and stairs that, I can understand, okay, next year if I do these things, then I can get to this position or I get this responsibility. Along the way, we need to continually be upskilling our teams. And that's also another way to overcome the finding challenge that you were talking about earlier, where we're in low unemployment right now in most of the world. And it's hard to find people outside the organization. Why don't we just give them different skills within the organization? Because then we know what kind of worker they are. They are already somewhat loyal to the organization because they've been here. So upskilling is all along the way. So I would use today's example of upskilling. How good are you at utilizing AI tools? Right? Everybody, the whole world was abuzz for the last 4 or 5 months about ChatGPT, right?
Sure.
And do you know how to use it? Does your team know how to use it? Does it make sense to use it? If it does, so that's a skill that can enhance a capability, but it doesn't necessarily take them off a pathway. So
Right.
So that's why I differentiate between pathways and upskill.
Yeah, in my experience, and I don't know if this is a best practice or not, it worked for us. I saw the potential for someone to excel in a completely different department.
Right.
Purchasing. This person was in customer service, and I thought she would make a great purchasing agent. Her personality, her skill set, her attention to detail, the way she communicated, and we needed that. So I pitched it to her, and it came with a pay raise. And I pitched it to her, and she was extremely apprehensive because I think she said, "What if I don't like it?"
Yeah.
So I made a deal with her. I said, "Look, for the first year, every quarter we'll meet, and if you don't like it, I will guarantee your former position."
Yeah.
So I'm willing to take a bet on you if you're willing to take a bet on yourself. And
Great.
and it turned out to be very successful. She had
And she
several
loved it?
years. She loved it, yes, and she excelled in it. So I got that. I mean, I made a lot of mistakes over my career. I got that one right, but I had to do something which normally companies have a policy that they will never demote, because once you demote somebody, all you're doing is paying them to look for another job, right?
Yeah.
And you get that quiet quitting kind of thing. So I didn't want that to happen, but I also wanted to protect her because I knew she was taking a risk. She was going beyond her comfort zone, but I just had faith in her.
Hard. I mean, it's hard to do at all, right? And many of us struggle with that in different aspects of our lives. It may not always be on the professional front, but it's called risk for a reason.
That's right. And the old adage, no risk, no reward. And let's talk about chapter 6, which I think is, I haven't read the whole book. I've read the chapter 1, which is the introduction to all the chapters. Yeah. And I think that's all that's available right now. So you're teasing your audience quite well. I'm anxious
June 20th. June 20th.
All right. And
you can buy it now, but
you can buy it now, but they're not going to ship it until June 20th.
And they'll give you a discount if you buy it now. But
anyway. Oh, there you go. Okay. Well, I'll definitely do that. And to my audience, since this came up, I will put links to where you can buy the book in the show notes. And I'll say that.
It's in, if you just search for Fire Your Hiring Habits,
Right. Yeah, I found it on Amazon, and it's probably available at
places.
At a number of booksellers. I think one of my favorite topics will be, or one of my favorite subjects will be culture. We have a very unique culture in our company, and it's very difficult to describe without sounding a little bit crazy. And the first test of that culture, I always thought we had a pretty cool culture. The first real test of it, where we really saw the payoff, was in 2020, March or so of 2020, when the governor of California announced that we're shutting down. And they made this very public announcement on TV, and they gave a list of what they considered essential businesses to be. Of course, we weren't on the list, at least not on that list. And then they said, and all other essential businesses as listed by the federal department of whatever. So that night, I'm on my computer, I'm searching, like, please let us be somewhere on a list. And the following day, the day after, we got what are called downflow letters from Department of Defense, basically through their contractors. So their prime contractors sent letters to their suppliers, we're one of them, and it said, to paraphrase very loosely, don't you dare shut down, you're an essential business, and here are copies of letters you can give to your employees in case they're pulled over by the police on their way to work. Why are you on a freeway? Why are you out of your home? No one knew if it would be enforced and how it would be enforced. So, the government reacted.
IPC helped do that. We were part of that as well. We were facilitating getting those letters to, making sure people were aware, because...
Yes, I remember that. Yeah, and that was much appreciated. So we had, a day or two later, we had kind of a all-hands meeting, and we told our employees, look, we're allowed to stay open. Here's the proof, DOD. And we have a job to do. We have orders to fill. We have customers that rely on us. And we intend to stay open. And we totally understand the fact that this is a scary time, particularly back then, because no one knew really anything at that point.
Yep.
And if you feel unsafe in any way to not come into work, then please stay home. We will pay you. It will not come out of your PTO. It will not come out of any, sick time. We will pay you. Now, keep in mind, our mindset was we were supposed to shut down for 3 weeks. That was the original, we're going to shut down until April. I'm like, okay, we can handle that. But not one employee chose to stay home and collect a paycheck. Not one. They all chose collectively. It was like right out of a Hollywood movie when, the Green Berets are searching for volunteers for a suicide mission, right? They're like, we're in. But that demonstrated to me at that very second, we have the right culture, because they had a job to do and they enjoyed their job. They felt fulfilled when they came to work. And I don't know. I don't think I ever really realized, other than it's a fun place to hang out. That's one advantage to a good culture. But I didn't really appreciate the monetary value of a good culture that everyone just fits. And until we had that one example of potentially having to shut down.
Well, and you're right. It's hard to see the monetary value of it, but it's probably ongoing all the time. It's not just limited to catastrophic events when, now it finally paid off that I had a great culture. But having a strong culture, a culture of acceptance, a culture of teamwork, a culture of, all these things that, as a leader of an organization, really set and determine who they are. So, at just about every place I've tried to work, I'm always thinking, what I want to be, right? What's the kind of, so for the last 3 positions, I believe, that I've interviewed every single person. I've had the good fortune of us being small enough that I could do this. Before they join, I have the opportunity to meet with them, and I get to share my vision of the organization, which is really talking about what kind of culture we have. I don't sit there and say, let me tell you about our culture. I sit there and let me tell you about the kinds of things that we do. Here's what what's important to us. Here's how we treat each other. Here's how, these type of things. So you don't just sit there and go, our culture is, box A, box B, box C,
And then they go, me too. Yeah, me too. Sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Right.
There's the old, what was the old, the Dilbert mission generator? I don't know if you ever saw that. They had, there was like a Dilbert website, and you could go to it and you could say, generate a mission statement for me. And they all sounded fantastic. And it was just totally like random words. But you don't want to do that. You want to actually have something that's thought through and meaningful to your organization. And that culture just encompasses so much. I mean, in the diversity and inclusion chapter, we talk about when people can be their whole selves where they're working, you get more, you win. This is part of that payoff of a culture, because they're not having to reserve a part of them back. They're able to contribute their whole selves, or all of their thoughts into your organization. So you're just going to get better work because you're not paying for 70% of a person, Right. It's like they're all in.
Yeah. One of the things that we've fought over the years, and the way we mitigated it is, let's say someone they're in the assembly department of our factory, and their job is to build a wire harness, so twist wires and cut wires and strip wires and zip tie them and all that. My goal is, if they go to a cocktail party and someone says, what do you do for a living? They could say, I strip wires and bend wires and cut wires and whatever. Or they can say, I work for a company that makes all the things that you buy that plug into the wall or have a battery more reliable. Yeah. Right? That's another way to look at it.
It's teaching the vision of the big picture.
The big picture, right. I mean, they're a cog in a wheel, yes, but they are part of a bigger, a bigger goal.
Are you familiar with the John F. Kennedy story when he visits NASA?
I'm not sure. Remind me.
He's walking there. They're getting ready to launch the moonshot, and as he's in a back stairwell, there's a janitor there, and he goes, "Oh, what do you do here?" And he goes, "What's your role? What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm helping put a man on the moon, Mr. President."
Exactly. So what we do to facilitate that is, when we get an order from a company, we do research on the company. We print out this kind of bio sheet on the company and what they do. And, because we want them to not think that their only job is to put a widget in a box and put shipping tape on it and ship it, or put a nut and a bolt together. We want them to be part of our larger goal. And, we don't make products that build things. We make products that make things that are built more reliable. And other people build things that all important. And we want our team to feel part of something larger than themselves, something larger than the company. And, that I enjoy that, and I feel that way. And I want everyone on our team to feel that way. And I think that helps with retention. It certainly helps with culture.
The other thing that the parallel I would draw is, it's not just about different companies, as you shared, just a brilliant example of that, but it's also some of those siloed organizations within a company. If you don't understand, especially say you're a multinational, right? I've got people working, or you've got suppliers that are overseas or what have you. There are always tensions, right? It's a push-pull as you're trying to say, hey, well, how come they didn't do it this way? I don't understand. They must be idiots. It's very easy to just say, obviously they don't get it. Why aren't they doing it the way I want them to? But if you can do that same type of thing of blending and integrating those cultures, and we used to do it, when I was at Bose, we used to send a couple of engineers over to our partners in Japan, and they would send a couple over, and they'd spend 3 weeks there working with the teams and getting to know the people. And you realize, hey, they're just like me. They've got a family. They've got hobbies. They've got things they're trying to do. They care about what they're doing. And after that, suddenly now it's not as siloed. It's not separate pieces, but there's communication, there's connection that's going between it.
I was on a cruise a few years ago, and we did a ship tour where we got to go up on the bridge. We got to go in the engine control room, and all the areas of the ship that passengers normally aren't allowed. And we were talking to the ship's engineer, and the ship's engineer, he was a Russian guy or Ukrainian guy or some place like that. And he says, the captain thinks he's in charge. Well, actually, it's a female captain. So he said, the captain thinks she's in charge, but the captain doesn't go anywhere unless I'm sitting here. He goes, I'm the one. She says, full speed ahead, and I'm the one that has to make sure that our generators are working and it actually happens. Because he goes, I actually make this ship go. And I love that. To me, that wasn't arrogant. To me, it was an acknowledgement that he's just as important as the captain.
That's right.
Just as important.
And that's part of it. People ask me, how do you end up with a success? How do you end up having success? And to me, the answer is work with great people.
Yeah, I used to consider myself.
You can take those areas and just run with it, right? You don't have to tell them what to do. It's like, let's all figure out the big vision, and they just kind of get, okay, this is my piece of that. I'm going to go make that happen, but we're all aligned.
When I started my company, I was young and arrogant. I was low 30s, and king of the world, nothing I couldn't do, and in my head. And I used to think, whenever I was in a conference room, well, I'm the smartest guy in the room, right? Now my goal is to be the stupidest guy in the room, because I consider myself pretty bright. But if I can be surrounded by people smarter than me, and that takes letting go of ego, it takes letting go of arrogance, and that's hard to do particularly for entrepreneurs, right? Because we're just the bull in the china shop. We just will it to happen, and against all odds. But I think once you show that vulnerability with your team, that you still, as a business owner, as a leader, you still have to show confidence. Everyone, if there's scary things happen, they all look at you and they look to see if you're scared. I fly a lot for a living, as do you. And if we ever get into like some really weird situation that I don't see very often, I'll look at the flight attendants, because they're on there every day. And I'm like, yeah, if they're starting to look scared, now I'm going to be scared. But beyond that, I think that they have to have permission to say you're wrong. They have to have permission to challenge you. They have to have permission to go against the grain a little bit. And kind of going back to your earlier example of the kind of the team of rivals thing, having one older, more experienced, sagey kind of person to put a little bit of resistance, a little bit of pushback, make them earn
answer the hard questions, and then let's go.
Exactly. Let's talk about getting help. When I started my business, I at some point in our business growth, I joined a CEO peer group, where a bunch of CEOs get together and pretty much lie every month about how well they're doing. And, but that was my way of getting help. And it was actually very helpful for the moment. And I've hired consultants over the years, and that's really been a good move for me, because I don't know what I don't know. What's your recommendation for getting help? There's a whole chapter 8 on getting help.
Yeah, so most companies, let's just use the electronics industry for our example here. The electronics industry, we're in the business of building great products, wherever we fit in the supply chain or value chain. We're typically not in the business of being an education institution or doing all this training we're talking about or upskilling. That's not the business we're in. And so partnering and getting help on those things. So one of the things that IPC does on that is we invest and work with the entire global electronics industry to create the programs that will help better and train, your individuals, so that you don't have to sit there and go, oh, I need an entire staff just to go through training. So a lot of it is about how do you partner to do the things that aren't in your core competency, and that's how you get help. You can go to your trade association, you can go to local community college, you can go to other different places to make sure that you're getting getting better content without having to create it yourself. I mean, the danger of being an engineer is you think you can do anything and you can do it better than everybody. It's just, I don't know what it is in engineering schools. I think they had to train us all to think that. But as I'm thinking about it, there's a great quote that I heard early in my career. He said, you should hire people that play at things you work at. Because you will, as some, can I program? Yes, I've been a programmer. I have an electrical and computer engineering degree. I could figure out how to program this. I can build websites. I could do, I could do all that. But I will never beat the software jockey that, she just loves this stuff and is just geeking out on it all the time. There's no way. So why should I hire that skill? So that's what the fundamental message is. And there's examples of where you can go find that help, so that as you're trying to build some of the aspects we talk about through the book, you don't have to do it all on your own.
Yeah. You've heard the old adage, if you love your job, you never work a day in your life. So I guess one of the goals is to hire people who love what they do. Right?
That's right.
We're starting to run out of time, but there's a couple of more questions I want to get out there.
I'll be
No, we're good. We're good. The nice thing about this, doing the podcast is, we're not trying to fill like a network TV show time slot, right? So we're it's a little bit fluid.
It'll be what it'll be.
It'll be what it'll be. Yeah, when I first started podcasting, I got some advice from some other podcasters, and they said, nothing should be more than 30 minutes. Never more than 30 minutes. That's kind of a rule. And I'm like, okay. And my first one was an hour. I'm like, okay, well, that's an exception. I've never done a 30-minute podcast. And the rule is just stop talking when you're done.
Yeah,
right?
when it's not interesting
When it's
anymore.
not interesting, stop talking. Right, exactly. And that's a skill set too. You talked earlier about diversity. I know there's a whole chapter on diversity. Tell me how we all hear the word diversity, and sometimes, ironically, diversity can be a divisive word because it's been politicized, beyond belief. Tell me about best practices in diversity and how diversity can be a savvy, profitable thing for the company.
Yeah. So let me refer to, and I refer to this book in my book as well. There's a very popular, I think it's listed in the top 100 business books of all time. It's a book called The Wisdom of Crowds by Surowiecki. And he gives some great examples, but I'll use the one in the preface, so there's no spoil alerts here, right? You'd read it in the first 5 pages. He shares an example of, like, from the late 1800s, there's a county fair, there's a steer that's going to be slaughtered, and people can put in their guess at how many pounds of meat are going to come out of this steer. And so there's steermen, there's butchers, there's milkmaids, there's little kids, all kinds of people. So like 920 people put in their answers. And sure enough, the winning answer, I think, is a steerman. But then the social scientist shows up and he takes all the answers and he pulls them all together and averages them, and they're closer than the steerman. So the point is, diverse opinions make you better. They make you better. So as I mentioned earlier, it's not just about gender or ethnicity. It's all the different ways that you can think about bringing diverse experience, diverse ideas into a group, and you do need some experts, but it should not be exclusively experts. And so that's the message of that chapter. And we talk about things you can do that are going to allow you to hire a more diverse group. And one way to tell if you have a diverse group, look around. Because frankly, if you're trying to say, we talk about it's really hard to hire people, especially right now, with what are we at? Single, less than 5% unemployment.
Like 3.5 or something like that.
Yeah, it's and if you're trying to find people in that environment and you're only looking in the same places you've always looked, you're limiting your pool, and that's a mistake. So if you can widen your diverse group, whether it's globally, whether it's for different genders or different ethnicities or different backgrounds or different age groups or different generations or whatever it may be, doing that suddenly widens your pool, and it helps that finding piece. See, remember how I mentioned that the back end also helps the front end?
Yes.
It all ties together.
You're getting old when you start any conversation with the word young people these days, right? Now I sound like my dad, because I was the young people that he was talking about back then. But at the risk of sounding old, young people these days, there's a stereotype. Now, the thing about stereotypes is they're unfairly broadly applied to whole groups of people.
Right.
Even if they have one toe in the waters of truth, they're widely applied. So let's take that one toe, and my experience, my observations, I'm not a sociologist by any means, but my observation is that younger generations tend to be a little bit more mobile. They tend to be a little bit less committed, and I don't mean that from as a negative stereotype. I mean that as, they may not buy a car. They may just Uber everywhere. They may ride share. They may, not buy a home. They'll just rent an apartment or a room. They may not want to work. Their long-term career goal is 6 months at a job, and then they're kind of very nomadic. It reminds me of the flower power. I was born in 1960, so I was never a hippie, but I remember as a kid I grew up near San Francisco, so I remember seeing the whole Haight-Ashbury scene, and it kind of reminds me a little bit of that generation, which was anti-establishment and all that. So is that somewhat real? And how do people like us who have, outgrown that or not experienced that work with kind of the newer generation that has slightly different concepts of success and commitment and things like that?
Yeah, so this is another section we cover in the book in depth about the various generational, what they're looking for in, basically up to 5 generations could be in the same workplace at the same time. And they look for different things. And you can actually promote a job in different aspects across all of those. And it can be the same job. You just need to make sure that you're fulfilling the aspects that you're talking about. So in your portrayal of what, we would call this, some of the younger generation pieces about transitory in terms of the workplace, there's actually a great study that showed that that's actually not true. When they find the right workplace, they tend to stay there, but they're looking for the aspects that they desire. And that's part of what we're trying to teach you about firing your hiring habits and changing your culture, because you want to keep these great people. And the way to do it is to provide an environment that's going to meet their needs and yours. And so you're not wrong. Those things do happen, but they don't have to happen. They're not a foregone conclusion, not just based on personality, but also just based on the aggregate as well. Because once they, if they're not suited for your organization, you want them to leave, right? You want to get the people who want to fit into your organization. And if you want some of the people who aren't fitting in your organization, you're going to have to figure out how to change that culture and who you are as an organization to keep those kinds of people. I mean, there's a fantastic interview. It's really, you don't see it popularized very far, but you hear a lot of Steve Jobs things, and I'm not going to even debate whether he's a good, a good leader or a bad leader. We'll just let the annals of time figure that out. But in this interview, he's, the guy, I think Jobs had just gotten off of a plane, and he's interviewing in the airport, and the guy asks him, he says, "So I've heard that you can be kind of tough on employees." And Jobs sits there, he gets thoughtful for a minute, he goes, "What I've found is that A players like to work with A players, and B players hire C players."
Now, what was the rule? It was a law of business that if you consider yourself a 10, you'll always hire a 9 or lower. And then the 9s get up through the ranks, and then they start hiring 8s. And then the 8s get up through the ranks, and they start hiring 6s and 4s and 3s. It degrades, kind of almost like, inbreeding. And because people don't hire people with greater skill sets than themselves, because they feel
that's
threatened.
Not true. That has to change.
It definitely, it totally has to change. But I think that is kind of an old rule of business. It's, like building empires and, siloing and all that stuff. It's a human nature. It's not a business rule, really. It's a human nature rule that we feel threatened when someone comes in that has a greater skill set than us.
But I think you find that people, as they learn more and do more, recognize they can't do all or know all.
Right.
And so once that they understand that, they're like, wow, you're fantastic over here. Just like you mentioned before, you like to be the dumbest guy in the room.
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with that. As soon as you know more than somebody that's supposed to be an expert in that area, it's time for a change.
Yeah. Last question, John. You wrote a book before this. What was that about? And then you teased everyone in your bio when you said you've written 2 books so far. What's your plan for the next one? So start with the first book.
Sure. So the first book was called The Scholarship Resume, Getting Your Share of Billions of Dollars Available. And it was, so I ran the Golden Key International Honor Society as the CEO there, and we gave away $1 million in scholarships every year. And then my doctorate was in, higher education and how to, run higher education institutes. So I had a lot of information about how people could reduce their costs of college for their kids. And I just thought everybody knew this. Apparently not. So somebody said, hey, so I people would invite me to their living rooms, invite a bunch of other friends over, and I'd walk them through, a lot of the different skills. And so that first book was just trying to capture that knowledge so I didn't have to live in everybody's living room.
You memorialized all the living room conversations.
Exactly.
Right?
So it's still, I think I published it in 2018, but it had been a work in progress for probably 6 years before that. It just, dabbles here and there as the books go. This one actually, we started in, the concept I came up with was in December of 2021. I wrote it in 22, finished the last word in December, and they said, oh, it's going to take a while to publish. So, but I have real copies.
Oh, good. It's off the presses.
It's off the presses. So, excited about that. It's not just mock-ups anymore, but it's not actually for sale until June. They actually thought, when they thought we did it with Forbes Books.
Yeah.
And that right then their supply chain expectations. You remember that supply chain problems we've been having? Maybe
Yes.
you've heard about it.
Yes. I've heard a few things about it.
It affected the paper industry too. Who knew, right? Toilet paper? I don't know. But anyway, so what was typically an 11-week window jumped to 22, which is why we pushed the book out in its launch.
Who would have thought that the supply chain issues would go down to books being delayed due to materials?
Totally did. And so once you set the date of the release, no matter how fast the print, so things got better. It came out much earlier, but
it's already set.
It's set. That's when it goes out.
Well, that's a publisher for you, right?
But it's a second question about what's next.
What's next? Yeah.
So I don't know for sure. I have probably half a dozen different book ideas in my mind. It's a matter of time and benefit. This book is primarily focused on and designed for anybody who's in a situation where they're hiring or leading a team. And I've considered, when I was first outlining this book, and I was reviewing the outline with Forbes, and they're like, that's just too big. It's too much. And so we basically cut it in half, because the other half was
I see a part two.
How do you excel in the business environment? Not just how do you. So this one's about hiring. Maybe in the future someday we might write about how to succeed in the corporate landscape.
Yeah. So one is the person who hires, and one is the person who is hired.
Correct.
In terms of who it's
for. So that's an idea. We'll see if it goes anywhere.
I think it's a great idea, because that also helps the companies who hire someone. I would love to know all of my team is reading a book about how to excel in my business. I mean, I would buy the book and give it to everybody, right?
Well, there you go.
It would be required reading. So you got a few customers for your next book already.
Okay.
All right. Well, John, thank you so much for your generous amount of time, and congratulations on the book. And I look forward to seeing it released. I will order a copy in advance. And,
very good. And know that you're helping the electronics industry workforce when you do so.
Absolutely. Well, we're doing it all for the team, John. We're doing all for the team. Right.
Helping out with the foundation.
Right. Well, great luck with the book and continued success with IPC. And I really appreciate you being my guest today.
My pleasure. Thanks for asking.
Well, that's another episode. Thanks for listening to or watching the Reliability Matters podcast. Our podcasts have been downloaded more than 35,000 times, and I remain ever grateful for your support and encouragement. Don't miss an episode. Listen to the Reliability Matters podcast on your favorite podcast app, or watch it on the Reliability Matters YouTube channel. If you're watching this on YouTube, click the subscribe button and the bell icon to be notified when new episodes are released. If you're listening to this on your favorite podcast app, also click the like and subscribe button for the same reason, so you know when new episodes are released. We do release new episodes on the second and fourth Tuesday of every month. And a special thank you to Circuit Assembly Magazine's PCB Chat at pcbchat.com and Ascendo Reliability at reliability.fm for syndicating this show. Thanks also for your questions and episode suggestions. Please keep them coming. Send questions and comments, episode suggestions to my email address, mike@mikeconrad.com. Just remember, that's Conrad with a K. Well, once again, thanks for listening or watching. Until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, stay happy, and perhaps most importantly, keep doing it right. And I'll see you again in 2 weeks.
Thanks for listening to the Reliability Matters podcast. Join us on the second and fourth Tuesday of each month for new episodes of Reliability Matters.